This is Q&A number 18, and I have some questions from Tina from St. George. Tina asks several questions, and I'm just going to go through this quick. I'm going to read her questions, and then I'm going to answer them. And then there's some great questions in here. I think I'll make some more videos in the garden about these as time goes on, but I want to get this Q&A out quick because I think it's going to help a lot of people, not just Tina. Okay, so she says, right now as I'm planning my garden layout this year, I'm interested in learning about crop rotation. I'm planning on switching my tomatoes and beans up, planting the beans where the tomatoes were and vice versa. Yeah, that'll be okay. I have some pretty strong opinions about crop rotation. I don't think people need to rotate crops hardly at all. And this is different than what I used to teach because I used to think the old way, but I've met a lot of rule breakers lately who simply are not doing crop rotation and they're just fine. No, if you have disease in your soil, you have a disease that's attacking like tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, those are all in the same plant family. If you better be rotating if you have disease. But if your crops are growing healthy and good, don't worry about rotating. And this is great because that means you could build a permanent trellis and grow the same thing on it year after year. How should I rotate my melons, squashes, brassicas, and cucumbers? I've built a lot of trellises with reclaimed materials, so I want to utilize those as much as possible. Yeah, that's perfect. You know, if you're having disease, you need to rotate. If not, I wouldn't rotate. And just give it 4 or 5 years and see how it goes. There's going to be a lot of gardening people who tell you that I'm nuts, but I think we rotate more than we need to in our gardens. Fertilizers. How much? How often? I love natural stuff. I meant to get a ton of leaves into my garden at the end of fall, and I just didn't get to it with all the canning I was doing. Okay, perfect. So fertilizers. Your organic fertilizers are going to be the best thing. It sounds like you already love that natural stuff, so that's good. The one fertilizer that I use that is like the main thing and maybe the only thing you ever need is compost. Just make a lot of compost or buy it, put it on your garden surface, and then plant your plants directly in it. If you start out with 4 to 6 inches when you first start, then put your transplants down in there. So that would be like the first year on bare soil. Then the next year, you just add an inch. Once a year, you add an inch and you can plant 2 or 3 crops throughout the year in that. I'll talk more about that. My garden is a conglomeration of row gardening and trellises, some garden boxes, which actually didn't do too well last year, and large pot patio-sized veggies in them. I'm a little all over the place, but that works for me. I have a little fenced spring garden, then the rest is my summer garden. Okay, so you're in St. George, Utah, which is pretty hot. Anytime you have a raised bed of any kind, like boxes, pots, that soil temperature is going to be hotter than the soil temperature that's down at the ground level. So that could be part of the reason it's not doing well. It's going to evaporate. The water, the moisture that's in there is going to evaporate a lot quicker. That's one of the reasons people build raised beds, is because they want that water in the springtime when snow is melting, when it's cold, they want that water to evaporate. When water evaporates, oxygen comes into the soil and it helps to feed the microbial life, it helps to feed the plant roots. So in St. George, none of that is really applicable. You're in a desert. You're on the border of the Mojave Desert. You're basically gardening in the Mojave. So you've got to think maybe a sunken bed would actually be better in that climate. I'm not saying to build a sunken bed, but anything that's raised or a pot, a garden box, I think you're going to struggle with that unless it's in the shade. And if it is in the shade, then some of your plants may not get enough light. So it's kind of a trick there. But what I would tell you to do is just have a flat garden and not do the raised beds in that environment in St. George. I grew up in Hurricane, almost the same climate, so I'm very familiar with what you're dealing with there. Okay, my biggest question, I want to get more bang for my buck. I should have a lot more tomatoes and peppers on each plant than I had. It's hot here. What do I do to increase my yield for those? My number one question back to you is, are you growing heirloom varieties? If your answer is yes, I would say stop. And people are going to hate me for this. Stop growing heirlooms if you want to have big quantities of things to harvest. This is a 2-hour class to tell you why. First of all, let me say something. I love heirlooms. I love the old-fashioned varieties. I love a plant that has a history, a cultural history, special flavors that go with specific recipes. They came from a long ways away. I love all that historical stuff about garden plants. I love to grow heirlooms. I do grow heirlooms. The problem is heirlooms were bred for a specific place, like a climate, and they do well in that climate. When we take them to a new climate, they don't adapt well, and they are inbred. You have wide genetics in a new plant, and every generation that you save seed from that same plant, that wide scale of genetics gets more narrow and more narrow and more narrow, because every generation, an heirloom doesn't stay the same. We think it does, but if you go back 150 years, it was different, because every time you save seed, it changes a little bit, and that child from that parent is smaller and smaller and smaller. So with peppers and tomato heirlooms, they have reached a bottleneck of genetics. And so when you take them to a new area, they're going to have pest problems, they're going to have disease problems, they're going to have low productivity, they're going to have problems with the temperatures, the overall climate, how much water they get. Even they could have different problems with the habits of the farmer who's raising them. The more bottlenecked you get in those genetics, then the more potential problems you can have. And heirlooms are very bottlenecked. I'm going to say something I shouldn't say, but all of them, it may not be all of them, that's why I shouldn't say it, but I think all heirlooms are very bottlenecked, which makes it really hard for us to grow them in areas where we shouldn't, or where they're not native to. So maybe you're not growing heirlooms, and maybe that was a big explosion I just made about heirlooms, and you're not even growing those. But usually people who are home gardeners like heirlooms, like me. I love heirlooms. The problem is it's hard to grow them, especially in difficult climates like St. George, Utah. So let me actually answer your question now. You want to get a lot more tomatoes and peppers. You need to get some varieties that are specifically developed for hot, arid regions. So go to your seed catalogs and start looking for the varieties that do well in the hot, arid regions. I'm going to be teaching classes on landrace vegetables, and it will help to clarify this. But if you became a seed saver and you started saving your own seed, and you were breeding in your own backyard, you're breeding for the ones that do better. Save the seeds only from the tomatoes and the peppers that did really good and that taste good. Save those seeds. Even if it didn't do good, if it did better than the others, save those ones. Plant it next year. This is hard to do with heirlooms because they have very short amount of genetics. You need wide genetics to do this. So if you had 10 varieties of tomatoes, it would be better, because then the pollen could cross-pollinate, and then you pick the ones that did the best. The next year, because that pollen cross-pollinated, your genetics widens and your plants can start figuring out what to do. And then within 3 to 5 years, you should be able to develop a landrace for your specific climate that does better than what's happening now. But to start off this year, go to your seed catalogs and start looking for varieties that are going to fit your need. I don't know if you want giant tomatoes, big tomatoes, slicing tomatoes, or cherry tomatoes. I don't know what you want. So if, start looking for those types, and then look for ones that are bred for the desert. Same with peppers. Peppers should be doing pretty good in St. George because they're a hot weather crop. And you say that they're not doing as good. If you're raising them in those your raised beds, stop doing that. And you need to conserve moisture. So get 4 inches of mulch on top of your soil so that when you water, the water stays in there. If you're using a drip tape or any kind of an irrigation system that's not sprinkling, then put it on the ground and then cover it with 4 inches of your like compost or mulch, whatever you're using. And that will help conserve the moisture. Make sure, okay, so you're saying, what do I do to increase my yield for tomatoes and peppers? One thing that you can really do to increase your yield, make sure that you're planting early down there. You should be getting your tomatoes and peppers in April. Most of the people I talk to are May, but you're a month ahead down there. Get them in April, maybe March. One of the things you could do is try to find an old person who has a beautiful garden, and you know who they are in town. Knock on the door and say, you have a beautiful garden every year. What varieties do you use? And can you tell me something about gardening? If you invested a good 30-minute conversation with somebody like that, it could really help for that specific area. When I lived in Hurricane growing up, we would grow 20 or 30 different varieties of tomatoes. Seems like they always did pretty good. We did irrigate them, soak the ground completely twice a week. Every Tuesday and every Friday morning, we would irrigate and just soak the ground. So I know you can grow them really well there. You can have big, beautiful crops. The flowers will burn up in the hot weather. If you can put them where they get some afternoon shade, in the heat of summer, in July and August are scorching there. So if you need to get some shade, if you can plant them where there's a shade tree from like 2 o'clock until 6 o'clock at night, that would be ideal. Most places I tell people not to shade their tomatoes. In St. George, shade your tomatoes in the afternoon. Fertilizers. I use fish fertilizer. I use just a mix that you can buy it anywhere. I just get it off Amazon. A gallon of it should last you for a year or two. You mix a teaspoon of that fish fertilizer into like a gallon water, and then you water your plants with it about once a month. One more thing, I'm assuming you're tilling your soil. You might do better, especially in St. George, where you're in the where you're there in the Mojave Desert border, to not till your soil, to go to a no-till system. And so the way that would work is just, you already have your garden areas, just don't till them ever again. And what I want you to do is put 4 inches of compost across your garden, and then start most of your plants from transplants instead of seeds. Well, start your seeds, but don't start the seeds in the garden. Start them in little trays, and then when they're big, just poke a hole in the compost and push it down in there, and I think that will do really good for you. I've been giving a lot of people that advice lately, but I think that's really going to help your crops to do a lot better. If anybody watching this has any clarifying questions you want to ask about this, please do so. Just send me a question in the comments section of Patreon, and I will try to fix anything I messed up in this video for you. Crop rotation, don't worry about it. Just plant your crops. Intensive gardening, companion planting, interplanting. Intensive gardening is great. Let me talk about that for a minute. A lot of times with intensive gardening, people are trying to put the crops too close together. What I like to do is put crops really close together, plant them, the transplants at the same time, but have ones that will come out in 30 to 60 days when the other ones need more room. So if I'm growing something like a megaton cabbage that's going to get gigantically big around, then I could plant radishes all around it while it's starting to grow. The radishes are long gone way before that cabbage gets huge. Another crop would be lettuce. I could plant lettuce around that. The lettuce is gone and harvested way before the cabbages get giant. So that's how I like to do companion planting and interplanting. As far as companion planting goes, with one crop helping the other, or with some crops hurting another one, I've planted all of my crops together before, and I have never seen one crop hurt another crop. That has never happened. And some of the books I've read say that you should never plant certain crops near other crops because they don't like each other. That has not been my experience. As far as crops helping other crops, I have never actually seen a significant increase in the crop yield that I harvest by planting crops together.